gentlemen, you take your seats now and we'll start our Q&A session.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. My question relates to the talk yesterday at the National Press Club by Dr. Tom Calma on this very topic. And he raised the issue of racism and discrimination. And he said that is the central cause for all these other problems. The health outcomes, the educational outcomes, the incarceration outcomes. He said that is the main problem, racism and discrimination of indigenous people. And so I just want to hear from you to what extent you think that is the central cause, rather than looking at the effect of being behind in education, etc. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think it's a really good question. I think it's really important. Tom Calma is a bit of a hero, so I think the first thing to say is, particularly observing that both Andrew and I are non-Indigenous men, and feel slightly awkward talking on behalf of all Aboriginal people everywhere. We're not doing that. Tom Calma's absolutely spot on. I think it's too easy to dismiss racism as being the R word. It's become such a horrendous accusation of being racist, and we tend to reserve the term for the more severe end of the spectrum. But I think it's worth reflecting on all of what we do. Again, that's sort of the casual ways of thinking that we have. So in the medical profession, we'll hear people say things like, "Oh yes, well, I treat people all the same. I treat all my patients the same," which is actually really unhelpful, because we shouldn't be treating all our patients the same. We should be treating our patients according to need. Now, you wouldn't classify that as a racist statement, but it is. I get abuse on Twitter for saying that, but it is. And we don't think of that as being in the racist end of the spectrum. And so I think racism is at the root of it. I think racism now, and historical racism, so that we've not come here from a vacuum, from nothing. But we need to examine our own attitudes and our own myths about who we are and who Aboriginal people are and what our cultures are. We need to stop thinking about culture as being something that those strange people over there have, and being about just painting and corroborees in the evening. We need to realise that culture is a worldview, and we all have lots of cultures that we identify with. But it needs to be a much more reflective conversation that we have. I think racism is a crucial issue, but we can't just dismiss it to be the extreme end and then everything's okay. It's actually, it's a much more subtle examination that we need than that. And I suspect, and that's to agree with Tom Calma.
I don't have a great deal to add to that, and I certainly would agree with everything that Tom Calma says. He started the Close the Gap campaign, and he certainly across these issues. I suppose I would also add issues around trauma. I think big issues that seem to get very little attention. But certainly racism has been a central part of what the Aboriginal Health Leadership Forum called for in an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander health plan. When they sat down with government, they really turned the plan on its head when they said racism and discrimination needs to be front and centre, as does culture. So I think Tom's spot on, and it's a similar message that many Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander health leaders have given to government.
Next speaker.
I just wanted to sort of start with the thing that I think we've got to stop talking about, closing the gap that's like that. This isn't the gap, and I had some problems because we constantly talk about the bad stuff. That's the gap. The gap is between what we know about Aboriginal society and what we do to Aboriginal society, and I just think we really actually need to turn ourselves around and start talking about it in that way, which is exactly, I think, the same point that you were making there. I did have some problem when you constantly produce the statistics that are actually terrible. They are terrible. But a bit like the film Utopia, you end up with a sense that there is actually a problem we can't solve. And I find a lot of people who come up to me when I work in this area and say things like, but we had to do something. And you say, well, you didn't have to fuck them up entirely. You know, and I think that's really what we actually have to sort of start talking about, because we really do need to start looking at what we're doing wrong, not what they're doing wrong. In a sense, we have to actually start talking about the way that the racism does creep into almost everything we do with all sorts of assumptions. I mean, the Forrest report that came down recently is appalling. It's deeply racist because it makes an assumption that they all have to turn into right-wing, white, male dead shits like the, you know, the ideal community citizen of the moment. I just think we've got to actually really sort of reframe the arguments, to have a look at it. And there's a lot of data. They've just closed down, I've been told, the Institute of Health and Welfare, which actually produced their stuffy lot. I'm a statistician and academic with a background in this area. And they've actually managed to close down the organisation that was putting together all the statistical evidence about what works and what doesn't work. And they're going to close it down so that is not accessible. We know what works, and what doesn't work, they say what works is bottom-up, culturally appropriate, with people, not for them or to them, and so on. And what doesn't work, cookie cutter, top down, short term, etc. And what does the government do every single time? Cookie cutter, short term, etc. We know we're doing the wrong thing. So if we keep talking about the problem rather than the solution, and our solution, I just think we are going to be stuck in exactly the same position. And yes, this government is doing some very bad things in this area, including getting rid of all sorts of really good things, including the deadlies, which was one of the areas of health and good health messages. But let's face it, what some of the things that Macklin did, including income management and the Northern Territory intervention, were appalling and just as racist as the current government is doing it now. So I think we actually have to look at the fact that the Labor Party has a very bad record in this area over the past few years. Back at some stage it was better, but it's not good now. And we need to take a really good long look at the left about the fact that we don't just keep bleating about the inequalities, but we actually start addressing the fact that we are responsible for them in our daily lives and everything else. And I just think that if we're really serious about closing the gap, and that they do talk about close the gap versus closing the gap, that we actually do have to take a good long look at what we do in our society that excludes people. And I mean, Aboriginal societies is a very clear area that we are incredibly deficient in. And I think if we close our gap and start talking about it in those terms, we might end up, and I did have a shot at the people tonight because we don't even have an Aboriginal person talking to us.
Eva, excellent comments.
Well said.
We tried very hard to get Linda Burney. We really tried very hard.
There's a lot of Aboriginal people, they live up the road.
Look, we're a small group. We have to do this in our spare time. At first she said she would be a speaker. Then she found something else that she had to do. So really, our thought was to get, of course, a significant Aboriginal leader.
You don't have to have a significant person.
But we're not getting on. I'm just saying that we did try, okay?
Try harder.
Try. We will try harder. Yes.
Good.
Thank you.
Got a comment to make?
You're speechless.
I don't know if anybody wants to make a comment.
Look, I don't disagree with what, I've never disagreed with what Eva said. Ever since she was my lecturer, it's always a dangerous thing to do. I would say that part of what I was trying to say at the end of my talk was exactly what the point that Eva made. That is, the solutions are known. Aboriginal people have been calling them forever, just government's not listening. Is empower and allow for local decision making, the community control health organisations, legal services, family violence prevention services, the points that Tim was making. I certainly take the point that we can get lost in negativity, but I think that those solutions, I agree that the solutions are absolutely well known, and that was the points that I was making towards the end.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Microphone? Oh, this one's got a microphone.
Hi. John Pilger in Utopia was talking about treaty, and 2 days ago there was a new campaign video about calling for treaty by Aboriginal elders. It was shown on NITV, SBS. And until we have a treaty or treaties with Aboriginal people, with different nations, and where genuine treaties are and basic human rights for Aboriginal peoples are enshrined in the treaties, and land rights as well. Until we have that, would only then not health be, improved for Aboriginal people only after Aboriginal people do have the equality in this country and do have the same rights and basic human rights and Aboriginal land rights, until that is solved? Good question.
ANTAR's position is one of support for treaty or treaties, and we have done some work on this in the past. Certainly the representation and the involvement in public life and political involvement of Maori people in New Zealand that came out of the Waitangi Treaty many years ago in the 1800s has had a positive impact. Life expectancy is less for Maori people in New Zealand. I'm not sure of the direct relationship with health, but it's absolutely something that ought to be done, that should have been done 150, 200 years ago and was never done. It's unfinished business that needs addressing.
The fortunate position I'm in being a doctor is that I don't understand law, so I shall give an amateur's viewpoint on this. And my sense is that there's a debate around at the moment about constitutional recognition in a big campaign, and it's worth going and seeking out. Both Amy McQuire and Celeste Liddell have written articles in the last few days saying actually this has become a big whitefella campaign. Now I support recognised, but I think we've got to take those views seriously, and I think the same discussions are around a treaty. I don't know the ins and outs. I know there's a wide variety of opinions on that. I think as non-Indigenous people, we have to say, look, what is it that's, that Aboriginal people want? And I think one of the tragedies is defunding the Australia's Congress, National First Peoples Congress, because it's a representative body. And so I think we're losing that sort of representative voice. I think the complexity around the treaty with what are actually multiple countries around Australia is quite difficult to do. Who negotiates between those different things? So my answer is I don't know. I would be guided on Aboriginal people across the country and representative bodies as to say, well, what's going to work here? What's going to be the things that will enable you to be included in our country after over 200 years? What are the things that will enable the whole of the rest of Australia to celebrate the fact that we have the oldest continuing culture on the planet right here? And so I think those are the sorts of questions. I don't know the legal niceties. I would in principle support it, but I think I wouldn't want to go in saying, hey you guys, this is what you should be doing, because that's not a method that works.
Next question.
Yeah, hi. That's a nice segue, I think, to what I was going to say, which is it's time to get personal. Treaties and saying, national apology and all of that hasn't worked, that's why I think the Beyond Blue campaign and the ad is so beautiful. You cannot look at that and think, oh my God, have I been in that situation where somebody in an emergency ward or something needed my help, my interpretation or whatever. It has to get personal. Treaties, National Apology Days have been great. We've all wept at them, and not wept at them rather. And you kind of think, but just one other incident I had when we were doing some media training for people who were attending the AIDS 2014 conference. One was an Indigenous guy, and he had, apart from everything else happening in his life, he actually had kidney stones removed. And of course, when he got to a regional hospital in New South Wales, and I shouldn't name it, but I think it was Port Macquarie, so I should be careful here. But it was a regional New South Wales hospital where the matron said to him, "What are you doing here with your filthy disease? Why didn't you take that to some other place?" He said that. Now that comes back to being personal. Somebody else in that hospital he should have felt comfortable, but we said to him, "Didn't you go and report that?" Everybody in this room, if you had suffered anything, even a tenth of that, you would have gone and reported that. You would have said, this is what this person just said to me. They don't have the confidence to do that, and why would they? That's why we have to be personally advocates for them. You can't just sort of say, "Oh, isn't that sweet how we've got a national treaty or apology day." They're very important. I think they're great symbols. But really, until you're going to stand up there in an emergency ward in a hospital and say, "Did you just speak to that guy that way?" Or "That guy was here first." You know, what the hell? We've got to actually really make it very personal. It won't change until it's personal.
It's a really good point, and I think we all need to find those opportunities to speak out. I'd sort of say, I phrased it at one point as being sort of listen to them leadership, that people will ask me as a doctor my opinion, and my role is to say, I'm the wrong person to be asking. You need to be asking this person here, and wherever you hear racism, standing up against that and saying exactly as you say, what you say to that person. As GPs, we're encouraging GPs to ask all their patients whether they're Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, so that they can do appropriate care for them and provide appropriate care and some different clinical care. I'd encourage you all, next time you go to your doctors, to say, "You're going to ask me? You're going to ask me, am I Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander? Thank you for asking. No, I'm not." And it just gets attitudes out there that change slightly. And people go, "Well, I can't assume, I do have to act." And so just little things like that, of making a stand, will make it personal, that you can all leave the room and do things like that.
I just want to ask one question here very quickly. Countries like America and Canada have got racial problems too. They had racial problems. Is there anything that Australia can learn from those countries about how they treat their people, or are they just as bad as Australia is?
What a humdinger of a question that is. Okay, I don't have an answer to that. I'm thinking about that question with the stories from Ferguson ringing at the back of my mind. And I'm thinking of a story that someone I work closely with told me, who is an Aboriginal, very respected person in our community, who's bringing up her son, who's now a teenager, to respect the police and say, "Look, if you get into trouble, the police are there for you." Who then had an experience where the police abused him, and has undone all this good work that the mother had done in saying, "The police, you can trust the police, they're there for you," and he doesn't now. And so I don't have an answer for that. I only know that I hear stories too often of people being harassed because of the colour of their skin, and that it happens here and it happens elsewhere, and that I'm aware as a white male, I don't experience that, but I hear from way too many of my patients that they do, and regularly.
There's a couple of things I think that have come out of Native American experience that various researchers have looked at. One is called the Harvard Project, that looked at when you implement self-determination and actually truly pursue self-determination in communities, that all of the social and economic indicators start to improve. And in some of the communities that they looked at, there were communities that had treaties in place. The other approach that springs to mind is one of justice reinvestment, and that is where you take some of the money that you spend on the criminal justice system on locking people up, and you actually spend that on the sorts of services that go to the root causes of issues around incarceration. And in America, that's where that approach emerged from, in a number of African American communities, where they found that most of the people being locked up were from a very small community, and when they looked at it, they found that the communities had no support services, no family services, poor crime approaches with little diversion, poor housing, homelessness, etc. So I think there are things that can be learned from America in general, but they certainly don't have all the answers either.
Good response. Question?
Hi, I'm a Gadigal woman descended from the Badawang people of the Yuin Nation, and I'm slightly upset there's not an Aboriginal person speaking, though I do realise you tried to find somebody. I can give you some names next time. I work at Jumbunna Indigenous House of Learning at UTS, and I go to UTS as a student as well. And we haven't spoken about education in Tonight, but obviously that's one of the key issues that need to be addressed. We recently heard that New South Wales Uni, Nirrigili House are shutting down, which is the Aboriginal house at New South Wales Uni, and Sydney Uni's Aboriginal services are severely reduced. I'm very lucky to work at UTS because they have a very strong Aboriginal body there, but I wonder how we can possibly even start to consider closing the education gap when these services are being reduced and shut down regularly. And to answer your question about why the man didn't say anything, it's not how Aboriginal people tend to be fairly self-effacing and won't address things like that. Do you have any thoughts about education, I guess is my question.
Thank you for your question. It's a really important point. Education is one of the key drivers to improvement, obviously. My experience comes from a combination of things, that seeing children come through the surgery that I work at, and just the sort of the expectations, the health problems that impact on that. So for example, simple things like otitis media, which are more common, leave children not being able to hear what the teacher's saying, which makes school really boring. Children who are going to school whose parents didn't enjoy school, or it's very difficult to go into school and engage with them. And I think, again, it comes back to the institutions that we create to say that they're welcoming. I've got a friend who did Churchill Scholarship, who's a school principal, and he saw what they did in Alaska for the indigenous people there, and they revamped the school timetable completely to fit in with the traditional cycles following the moose. And lessons were involved around that, involved around cultural activities in the snow, and they increased their rate of attendance and completion of school enormously. And I think we've sort of just considered school as being, it is what it is, it doesn't change, and people have just got to do more of getting into that. But I think we need to, again, consider things like alternative ways of constructing school timetables, making it welcome for children and parents, the levels of support through university. One of the work I do with the college is supporting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander doctors to become fully qualified GPs. And the sorts of other challenges that they've got going on that makes it difficult to go through to that, it's all achievable. These are people who are really able to do it, but sometimes just need other supports around that. I think it's a tragedy that universities are cutting back on that. Sadly, with the direction that university and education policy seem to be going in, so Gonski will have a huge impact. If we don't do Gonski, that'll have a detrimental impact on Aboriginal school outcomes. Deregulating universities and university fees will have an impact on whether people think they can ever attend university. When university budgets are stretched, the first thing they'll do is take away supports for people who really need it because it doesn't look efficient. And we'll see that, and that will have, I mean, from my point of view, impacts on health, but impacts on a whole range of other more important life things too. So, no answers. But I absolutely take your point, and it's the whole of life cycle approach, right from being preschool right through to being
elderly.
I think it's a really good point around education. I think Tim covered very well. I would just make the point that the sorts of punitive, big stick approaches that are being proposed, particularly through the Forest Review and by the government in particular, are not the right way to go. They're so simplistic and paternalistic, and I don't think they're going to get the sorts of outcomes that you might want from a decent education system and approaches that actually take account of culture and community. So I think that's heading in the wrong direction. And as Tim said, in the cuts to Aboriginal services in universities and centres is a real tragedy.
My name's Don. I'll just make a quick observation that about what we can learn from, say, the USA is probably not very much, except for the wonderful grasp of political strategy that we saw in the civil rights movement. And we can say the same thing also about the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. This excellent grasp of political strategy to tackle racism within a broader social construct. The question I've got though is more to pick up a bit further on the Forest Report. My question is, what do you understand to be the analysis of Aboriginal organisations or leaders of two interventions? Firstly, the Forest Report and mining corporations in general and what they're doing in Aboriginal communities. And then secondly, a very different intervention we read about recently with the replication of the Cuban approach to literacy development. What are Aboriginal communities leaders saying about those types of things?
I'm not sure on the latter part of your question. I think on the first bit about the Forest Report, I think it's fairly early days. Came out in the last fortnight, and it's a 300 and something page report. I have heard concerns about, again, the broader approach of really being punitive and wielding a stick rather than actually looking at other approaches that work with the community rather than in a paternalistic fashion. But I think it's got a bit of a way to go in terms of the reaction from Aboriginal people that I work with.
I don't know much about the Cuban approach, so I'm afraid not going to comment on the Cuban approach. They do amazing things and strange things in health, but I don't know about education. The Forest Report, I'm halfway through it. And I will acknowledge Aoife Cox, if she's still here, wrote a cracking piece in The Conversation. I urge you to go and read it. My impression, so your question about what Aboriginal people think of it is, I think, is like asking what do white people think of it. Is you will get the whole range of opinions from Tony Abbott through, you'll just get the whole range of opinions. And even watching Q&A the other night from the Garma Festival in Darwin, there was the range of opinions expressed there. So I don't think it's possible to say, yes, this is the Aboriginal opinion. I've seen all opinions, as you'd expect from any sort of particular group that we decide to lump together. Having said that, my opinion on it, do you really want that? Look, he accidentally bumps into some good solutions around preschool education. I was struck at how many times the name Andrew Forrest is mentioned in the report. And some of the language used just seems to be, you don't hear people from communities using words like idleness. And so to see that pop up in a section saying what Indigenous leaders are telling us really made me raise my eyebrows, and makes me wonder how much salt I'm going to have to take with the report. It looked to me like sorry, I'm being very honest, aren't I? It looked to me like a rich, non-Aboriginal man saying, "Oh, look at those people over there with culture doing their corroborees. Don't you dare do that during school time." And it just seemed, and I don't think that's going to be the solution. No, it's gone. There was something else I was going to say about it too. It's gone. It might come back to me. Let's have another question.
Next question.
I just want to further the question that Joe asked both of you about what can we learn from overseas countries, and you only really focused on the United States and said nothing about New Zealand. So what I want to ask you is that it is so important, of course, that Aboriginal people get political power, because that's where the policies are made. How significant, how much are we to learn from both the fact that a treaty was made between the British whites and the Maori in the late 19th century, but in our century, the Maoris had their own seats and they can elect their own leaders directly into the parliament, and in that way have significant political power. How significant a reform do you think that would be for Australia? What's your opinion about that? To follow the New Zealand model of designated seats, a number of them, for Aboriginal people who will choose their own candidates and their own representatives in the national parliament.
Thanks for the question. Again, I'd like to make the point that Tim made that I can't speak for Aboriginal people's views, of course. I think the representation in Parliament is a really important issue, and I think it's one that should be looked at really seriously. I think there's little doubt that the Treaty of Waitangi really made a difference to the nature of the relationship with the white invaders and the Indigenous people of that land. So I think that starts to change the nature of the relationship, both having an agreement but also having representation in the Parliament, and certainly that would increase the level of say in policy making and approaches. So I think it's something that should be looked at.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really good question. I think that the example from New Zealand does clearly show that in there a treaty has made a difference. But you also see, the treaty is easy to focus on, but you also see both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in New Zealand having a terminology that they use about who's who. And I don't see that we have that particularly in Australia. So who here sort of knows the word manungo or something, which is for Aboriginal word from Northern Australia for a white fella. We're not using that terminology. My instinct would be, yes, it sounds great, but how is that what Aboriginal people would recommend? Is this just allowing people representation in what is fundamentally a colonial system of government imported from England? Is that going to be a solution that's acceptable to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? And I just don't know the answer to that. And I think there's so much negotiation and talk and recognition of the fact of what's happened to get us to that point about saying, well, what are appropriate representation structures to make it meaningful. I think that's a conversation that's got to happen. I think one of the things that I've become really aware of as a doctor, and I suspect it's a non-Indigenous trait, is diving in to solve problems. It's very difficult for us to say, to stay quiet for a bit, and to not go and say, well, this is what you should do, this is how you solve that problem, and that's what we do all the time. It's a cultural trait that we have.
doctors particularly have it, and it can leave us looking stupid because we haven't shut up, and we haven't listened, and we haven't said, well, actually, what would you like? And I think we need to be aware of that.